Hi, this is John from Sharp Mountain Games, and today we're going to talk about introducing new players to role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons and, of course, other ones. And we'll do that right after the intro. So today's topic is introducing new players to RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons and other ones. So just to talk a little bit about my own experiences, I've been doing this for a long time. So I've introduced new players through convention games, of course, running for friends. I'm a teacher, so I've on occasion run for students at school, like during activity periods, and of course running online. And I'm sure many of you have had these same experiences. So what are some hurdles? Let's talk about the hurdles for new players. Often they don't know, what's this game all about? What exactly can I do in this game? And what can't I do? The dice can sometimes be a concern. We'll talk about complex character sheets, too many character options, and some special hurdles for running online. So let's deal with the hurdles one by one. What can I do? New players may not really understand, what it means. They may not know, what's a thief or what's a cleric and how does all this work in the game? So it certainly doesn't hurt, especially maybe before a convention game or if you have a number of new players, just to give a brief rundown of the mechanics. Hey, you roll this number, this dice, and you add this number to it, and here's how you do things. Another really, really important thing is if you can, sit them next to an experienced player. Now, I was an experienced player, but I remember the first time I played Pathfinder, it was really important for me. It was at a convention. I was sitting next to somebody who really knew the rules. So occasionally I could kind of whisper to them, okay, well, what do I do or how does this work? And they could fill me in. Huge, huge help. And I try to do that with new players if I can. But even as the game master or dungeon master, whichever you prefer, you're totally allowed to help them out with their choices, to say, okay, well, you're the thief. Maybe in this situation, you could consider sneaking ahead or listening at the door. Part of the responsibility is to be sort of a teacher or an instructor. And I also don't think for an inexperienced player that it's out of line to say, okay, you could try this, but there's some danger if you do that, so you might want to try this. You could give them the pros and cons, still let them make the choice. Don't take away the choice from them. But you might want to just, weigh the options to say, look, your sneaking ability is really low. You probably don't want to do that. Let somebody else do that. But your combat ability is really high. So maybe that's what you want to wait for. Dice are a hurdle for new players because they're so many different dice and they're not like any other dice we use in games like Monopoly. They have all these weird sides. And if you're experienced, it's like nothing. Oh, yeah, the D8 looks like this and the D10 looks like that. We sort of know it by heart, but they really don't. So here's one suggestion. It's not unique to me, but use a multicolored set, especially if kind of an ugly set, maybe that you cobble together from various dice, because it's so much easier to say, roll the blue one, roll the red one, rather than to say, well, roll the D20, when they may not know what the 20-sided dice looks like or the 12-sided dice, just because they haven't had experience with it. This second one is really stupid, but it's really true. If you're playing face-to-face, just get a shoebox lid, or if you have a tray or a dice tower, something like that, for them to roll the dice into. And not just new players, but it's just such a hassle. When it rolls and it falls on the floor, and do you play it where it lands, or do you re-roll it so it stays on the table? Get a shoebox lid. Get something like that, roll it in there, and it really isn't a problem. Now, here's another one, not unique to me, but I think it really helps. Maybe if you have a lot of new players or you're running in a convention, consider using only D20s and D6s. And this could kind of be heresy, seem like, for some folks. But it's not. Instead of a D4, roll a D6 and subtract 1. The average is the same. Now, again, some purists might say, well, you can't roll a 5 on a D4. True, but overall, it really doesn't make that big of a difference statistically. It really doesn't. And it's much easier if they always know I'm rolling a D20 and a D6 when I'm in combat. The 20 is to see if I succeed, and the 6 is to see my damage. If you want to need a D8, it's D6 plus 1. Yes, you can't roll the 8, but on average, statistically, you get the same average, which is a 4.5 on a D8. Same thing, a D10 can be D6 plus 2, and a D12, D6 plus 3. But if you are going to do this, do it also for your monsters too, because it wouldn't be fair for a monster to be able to score, 12 when your player character really can only score up to 9 if you're only using the D6s. So just make that same adjustment for your monsters or your opponents, and it will work out fine. And believe it or not, it's easier on the Dungeon Master too. Sometimes then we don't have to make put a lot of thinking into, because you want to keep the game moving. Now let's talk complex character sheets. And I have an example here from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, just because it's one I found online. But for those of you playing 5e D&D, don't tell me that that character sheet is any easier, because it's not. Now you might say, oh, well, this version or that version is easier. But for a new player, almost any version is going to be pretty overwhelming. So what are some options to avoid these complex character sheets? You could simply trim down the stats. You could just give them kind of the bare minimum they need. Maybe they just need the attributes. Maybe you don't need all those skills. Just the attributes and maybe your weapons and your spells or something like that. You can always introduce the complexity later. Nobody needs to learn it all at once. You don't start your math curriculum with calculus, right? You learn addition and subtraction, and you move up through the mathematics to get to the complexity. Now, here's another thing. If you really want to play fantasy or you really want to play D&D, you don't have to play the most recent version or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons or 2nd edition or some which have more complex rules. You could play a lighter version like Basic Fantasy, the old BX. Microlight 20 is still out there, and both Basic Fantasy and Microlight 20 are free. You could play a lighter version. You're still playing D&D. No matter what they tell you, you are still playing D&D. It may not be official. It may be, the home version, but that's just fine. I usually, when I have new players, I just say, hey, I run a lighter version than 5th edition. And nobody seems to mind. We just show them on the character sheet where to find things. Also, you could play a rules light game. You don't have to play necessarily even in fantasy, but you could play a lighter game. And the Microlight series of games are fairly rules light. There's something to consider, but there's other ones out there too, certainly. Now, for a new player, this is if you're having them make up their characters. There can be too many character options. There really are. So I would suggest maybe pre-gens, and don't have too many. You don't need 20. If you have 6 players, 6 or 8 pre-gens is just fine. I mean, you might want to have more than just the number of players, so to give them some options. But have the character sheets already made out. And there's certainly plenty of places to do that, or you can take an hour and do it yourself. I would not send them to online character generators. Not if they're new players. If you've seen some of the online character generators, and I don't want to name any in particular, some of them are really, really complex. Another option is you could just ask them beforehand. Hey, do you know what you'd like to play? And I'll make sure to have a character sheet ready. Here's some choices for you. You could ask them beforehand, and then that'll help you make sure you have ready what they'd like to play. Another option for too many character options is to consider archetypes, like the old basic expert there. Now, there's a lot of talk online nowadays about should it be called race or species, and I don't want to wade into that. Some people, they say, well, every elf can't be the same. I think if you're an adult player, you understand that. However, in the basic expert, you didn't necessarily play a halfling thief or a dwarf fighter or whatever. You just played a dwarf, or you just played an elf, or you just played a halfling or a hobbit. I don't think that's a bad idea for very new players. It really isn't. I think it was a really good way to get people in the hobby. With the understanding that, hey, this is sort of a typical adventurer. And then as things go on, if they want to specialize, well, hey, I'd really like my elf to be a cleric, or I'd really like my halfling to specialize as a fighter or a thief. You can always bring that in. But a lot of times for new players, they're just very content to say, yeah, I want to be an elf, or yeah, I want to be a dwarf, or I want to be something like a hobbit, because they've seen those in media, and they've seen those in movies and novels and things like that. It's a familiar, comfortable place to start, and there's nothing wrong with that. playing online has its own unique set of concerns and definitely warrants its own video, but let's just talk a little bit about some of them right now. The problem for new players online, and I don't think it's bad for them to start online, but you're teaching both the game and the interface. And some of the interfaces let you do macros and really advanced things, and those are all nice and good, but they're tricky. So sometimes that can be a concern, that you're trying to do two things at once. You know, it'd be like learning to play the piano and the guitar at the same time, and that's hard to do. You can't really do that. So some things you can consider if you're going to use pre-gens, just preload them into Roll20 or whatever your preferred virtual tabletop is. Have them all ready. Or you could just alternately put them in a Google Docs if you prefer and share that with everybody. You might want to have a quick meetup beforehand if possible. So if you know the person and you say, hey, could we meet up on Thursday at 5 just for 15, 20 minutes and I'll show you how everything works. Or say, you know, before the first session, look, I'd like to start gaming at 7, but if you want to get here at 6:30, we can start chat a bit, you know, get to know each other or, you know, have social time. And then I'll also run through how you do some things and how you find things beforehand. It's sort of like a session 0, you know, but more to teach the online interface. Be patient with online concerns. You know, sometimes people have technical difficulties or they can't find something. It just sometimes there's a little bit more of a lag, especially when people are learning. And there, even myself, having a lot of experience with it, if I'm playing a brand new system, sometimes it's tricky because I have to, all right, what do I roll on the character sheet and where do I find all this? And here's another thing to consider. And you can call me a Luddite if you want. There's nothing wrong with having paper character sheets. So you share Google Docs with them and say, hey, just print out this character sheet. And there's nothing wrong with saying, oh, you can just roll your dice at your desk and I'll trust you. If you're playing with someone you can't trust, don't invite them back. You know, they're always rolling all 20s and you think they're cheating. I mean, it can happen. Just don't invite them back. There's nothing wrong with kind of having an analog or a simpler component to this. I kind of like it myself to actually roll the dice rather than only rolling virtual dice. So what's your job as the GM? Is to give them a great first experience as best you can. Now, don't put so much pressure on yourself, you know, that's stressing you out, but try and give them as positive an experience as you can. Thank them. I always try to thank my players, and I know a lot of other Dungeon Masters do. Thank them for playing. You know, they gave up their time to be with you and to play your game. Ask them back. Hey, would you like to come back next week? Or we're going to meet again in 2 weeks. Would you like to consider coming back? And you might also ask them back for a non-D&D game. I only say this because, you know, D&D is certainly the elephant in the room and is the major player. But maybe they're not totally into fantasy, but you know they really like Star Trek or Star Wars or Doctor Who or superheroes or something like that. Say, you know, hey, thanks for playing this fantasy game, but I know you're a real Star Trek fan. You know what, maybe we'll try that next time. Would you be interested? And ask the other players if they'd be interested. Nothing wrong, and I think it's very positive with diversifying the hobby. The whole hobby is not Dungeons and Dragons. That's not a smear against it, but just to say, you know, again, nothing wrong with a broader perspective. So in closing, I'd like to say, I really think it's an honor to give folks their first experience with role-playing games. And, you know, overall, giving them that positive experience is much more important than anything specific about the rules. And heck, if you bend them a little bit, they won't know because they're new players. Now, it's worth pointing out, of course, that not everyone will become a long-term player. That's just the way it is, and there's no judgment there. But that doesn't mean they didn't have a good time. Certainly not. But here's the really exciting thing. If you do a good job, some of them will. Because, hey, we all started somewhere. So thanks so much for watching today. And if you'd like to check out the titles from Sharp Mountain Games, you can see our 2 in-print adventures, the Dwarven Pickup Truck and the Sky Tree at Amazon, Lulu, or drivethrurpg. You can also check out our digital titles, which include adventures, map packs, new character classes, and character cards, and they're at drivethrurpg or the Roll20 Marketplace. Wherever you like to shop, odds are that we're there. So you know what to do. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. All the links to our products are in the description below. And thanks, and we hope to see you again soon.